We're officially beginning the recording. And thank you for typing into the chat who you are and where you're joining us from today. Again, we're officially starting the session, the ELD Standards Framework, Language Arts, grades 4 to 5. And thank you for typing in the chat who you are and where you're joining us from. We'll just go over some of the meeting protocols for Zoom. I know you know a lot about Zoom. If you could just keep yourself on mute, but please use the chat at any time throughout the presentation to post a question or reflection or something that you'd like to know more about. And if you would like to put your hand up if you have a question when we have the share out time, just let us know by putting the hands up or typing into the chat. If you have any problems with access, as you know, you can just turn off your video. But if not, keep it on. We'd love to see everyone's faces as we share this information. Pam, over to you.
Thank you, Julie. Good afternoon, everyone. So nice to see you all here. I'm Pam Spiescher from the Region 15 Comprehensive Center, which is one of 19 federally funded regional comprehensive centers across our nation. The comprehensive centers provide capacity building, technical assistance, content expertise, and resources to state education agencies like the Nevada Department of Education. And we've been collaborating with the Nevada Department of Education on this webinar series. And now I'd like to introduce our presenters for today's webinar. Our two main presenters are Ebony Gabot, Assistant Principal at Somerset Academy, North Las Vegas, and Emery Rodriguez, Assistant Principal at Somerset Academy, Sky Canyon. And they are joined by Dr. Kulwadi Axtel and Dr. Sofia Misavich from the Nevada Department of Education. And now I'd like to hand it over to my colleagues from the Nevada Department of Education.
So thank you, Pam. And as we move into the next slide, let's think about why we have the ELD Standards Framework. And this framework was really developed in collaboration with educators from across the state, because certainly we recognize that the education of English learners is the shared responsibility of all educators. And we understand as we move across much of our instruction in terms of our ELD models, that English learners must have access to rigorous standard-based instruction in order to be successful. So next slide. So this webinar is part of a series designed for educators to learn how to use the ELD Standards Framework. And it is specifically designed for elementary ELA educators, instructional coaches, and all others that touch English learners. So in our next slide, we just really want to find out who's in the webinar. And if you would please, if you would really tell us what your role is: a classroom teacher, an instructional coach, an English learner specialist, or a teacher on special assignment, a school district staff personnel, a school administrator, or regional professional development program staff, NDE staff, or other. If you don't mind filling out the poll and let us know who's in the room.
I think we can publish the poll now over.
Okay.
So Sophia, there's the breakdown.
Oh yes, so what we see is that definitely we have representation of classroom teachers, ELA teachers, and we welcome certainly our instructional coaches, and our English learner specialists and teacher on assignment is at 47% of who's attending the webinar today. So good to see a school district staff member, a school administrator, and thank you so much for joining us. So in our next slide, certainly I would like to kind of introduce again our presenters for today. And so we really thank our presenters, Ebony Gabalt, and she's an assistant principal, as was mentioned, from Somerset Academy in North Las Vegas, and Emery Rodriguez, who is also an assistant principal from Somerset Academy, Sky Canyon. And so they have really collaborated with us to really bring you this presentation. And it's nothing like having people who work in the field, the practitioner, to really walk through what those connections are for these key documents, the ELD Standards Framework, to classroom instruction, lesson planning, and professional development. So next slide as we turn this over to Emily, I believe.
It'll be myself, Ebony. I'll be taking over. And actually,
Okay.
if you don't mind, Julia, can we just go back one slide so we can go over the agenda for today? And so thank you everybody for having us. Emery and I are super excited to be here with you today. And what I want you to know is that we get to learn from all of you too. So please share your greatness with us, okay? And so we'll get started by aligning to the ELD guiding principles. We'll move into quality learning of ELA. We'll discuss an example lesson with you. We'll talk about applying the ELD Standards Framework for ELA, and then we'll finish up with some questions and answers, okay? Next slide, please. All right, we're gonna get started with the guiding principles. They were designed with the belief and understanding that the education of English learners is a shared responsibility by all educators in order for English learners to achieve both English language proficiency and content achievement. More specifically, each of these components is important when guiding ELs towards achieving success within their educational journeys. Next slide. Here are the first 3 of the 5 English language development guiding principles. These are fundamental norms, behaviors, and values that are shared by all educators in the teaching of English learners. So the guiding principle number 1 speaks to valuing English learners' assets. So you might ask yourself, how are you prioritizing culturally responsive teaching? Guiding principle number 2 refers to teaching the grade level content with intentional scaffolding. So you might ask yourself, even as an administrator, how am I going to provide professional development opportunities to assist teachers with the training on how to scaffold so that they can be prepared? Guiding principle 3 focuses on providing multiple opportunities for extended discourse through multiple modalities. So again, how can you plan for discourse opportunities throughout your lesson? Next slide. Guiding principle number 4 focuses on teachers modeling how to develop awareness, but this also includes patience and perseverance when working to elicit engagement and production of disengaged ELs. So you might ask yourself, how am I modeling these processes in my instruction? How am I going through it and helping them understand how to model their thinking? Guiding principle number 5 focuses on teachers employing formative assessment practices to gather evidence and guide your next steps. So how do I ensure my assessments are aligned to the content and language goals? Slide 11, thank you. This particular chart is focusing on the importance of designing your instruction. So this is critical as we look at the other components. Think of this as an outline of your lesson and how it focuses on the concept of text analysis, which is what we'll be talking about today. A driving question should be, how can I help my students understand the focus of the lesson? Text analysis is helpful for many different contexts of ELA standards. In this context, we will be focusing on the main idea, and it will be surrounded by the evidence students will gather to support the main idea. So as you see with conceptual focus, it's aligned with guiding principle number 2. Participation by design aligns with guiding principles 2 and 3, and then the purposeful focus on language aligns with guiding principle number 3. So at the conclusion of this presentation or at this lesson, we should be able to formatively assess how students grasp the concept with their teacher's support. Next slide. All right, this process outline for lesson planning really models your teacher thoughts. So as you plan for the lesson, it also relates to guiding principles 1 and 3. So how can you plan for opportunities for students to share their lived experiences? How are you providing opportunities for students to engage in extended discourse? So, oh, I'm sorry, can you go to the next slide? I apologize. It looks like we got a little bit out of order. Okay, and we talked about this. Thank you right there, I apologize. So when we talk about establishing the purpose, set the why for reading the text. When you look at identifying text structure, that talks about whether or not it's an expository, narrative, or an opinion piece. When we talk about activating prior knowledge, we want to help them connect what they already know to the new piece of information. Of course, we want to build background knowledge. What do we want them to know about this prior to reading? And then we want to read the passage and plan for those purposeful questions so they can read with intention, and also create activities that will require them to apply their learning. Thank you. Next slide. All right, so you may notice that this slide is very similar to the previous slide, but the important part to note is that as educators, and if you click that next button, the next little, perfect, thanks. We must design the scaffolds in order for this to take place, those intentional scaffolds. So how are we providing those? Those structures would be like Kagan structures, right? Many of you are familiar with those. Choice of language refers to sentence stems. And this designed in scaffolding is identified in principle number 2, that intentional scaffolding, and also principle 3, providing those opportunities for extended discourse. Next slide. All right, so today our example lesson is focusing on RI 4.2, which is a 4th grade standard which focuses on determining the main idea of a text and explaining how it is supported by key details. So they will do this while reading about the Transcontinental Railroad. And by the end of this lesson or unit, students should also be able to summarize the text. So you always want to start by presenting the topic to your students with using visual representations. So as you see here, I chose a photo, but you can also do videos. Make sure you explain the purpose of reading the text and identify the text structure. For example, in this presentation, we will be reading an informational text about the Transcontinental Railroad and the important role it played for the United States of America. You could even start this unit with a broader question like, what were the benefits and costs, or the positive and negative effects overall of the Transcontinental Railroad? Next slide. You can go ahead and click that. The next important step is to activate your students' prior knowledge. So we will have students make predictions about the text by sharing their experiences. It's important to incorporate, cognates like tren, which is a Spanish word for train. Then you would provide an opportunity for students to share their lived experiences with one another through a structure for sharing. So in this example, I chose Rally Robin. It's important for you also to share sentence stems with them. And so these might include, but are not limited to, right? My experience being on a train happened when, or I rode on a train when, or I have noticed that trains, or that reminds me of, right? When they're responding to one of their partners. And the purpose of this Rally Robin is to provide students with an opportunity for discourse. In addition, those sentence stems help them learn how to present or formulate their ideas. Next slide. Please let me know if I'm missing anything in the chat. So next, I'm going to provide an example of building background knowledge. So explaining the 2 word parts first. So as you can see, the prefix trans means across or on the other side of. You would then talk about the word continental and that it means forming or belonging to a continent. So when you put those 2 words together, it means to transport across the continent. And as you can see, we also put a graphic. That would be a perfect example of showing the students how they can make that connection to the 2 words. So we will be focusing on the inquiry behind the Transcontinental Railroad and those involved in the process of building and funding the railroad. So really quickly, I just want you guys to put in the chat, thank you, Julie. Why do you think it's important to activate students' prior knowledge? And also, I know we said that we would be open to allowing some people to unmute and share as well. So please raise your hand if you'd like to share. I know you guys are like typing away on your end. All right.
Okay,
So to have something to connect their new knowledge to, absolutely, to build engagement and provide them with an accessible entry into the lesson, for sure. It gets students thinking meaningfully about the topic, absolutely, and make their own connections, which is super important. Tap into what they know, metacognition, misconceptions, provide schema, absolutely. You guys have got this. Great job. And then also it's important for students, so students can anticipate, right, how the text is going to be organized. If it's an informational text, they're going to be looking for those headings so they know which information to go back to and look at. It's also important for the teachers to lay out the language for the students. Yes, thank you, Julie. Thanks everyone for sharing. I'm going to hand it off to Emery and she's going to dig a little bit deeper in the lesson.
Okay. Hey everybody. So now that we have built background and we've activated that prior knowledge, we're going to be looking at interacting with the text and concept. And with this piece of text, this goes with the Transcontinental Railroad and main idea. And if you want to click one more time on the side, we have what are some ways that you have students interact with text. And you'll have students identify the main idea and supporting details with this text. And you'll notice that the vocabulary is provided as well, because we have to build vocabulary for students, which is very, very important. And providing those sentence stems as well. And so just thinking, what are some ways I have my students interact with text as you're presenting that text? Next slide. So as we were planning, this is a great tool to use, interacting with text. The Transcontinental Railroad, it's an informational piece of text. And our disciplinary practice here is for ELA, practice 1, supporting analysis of grade level complex text with evidence. So the performance expectations here are students will identify the main idea and 3 key details as evidence to support their analysis that have been agreed upon with their partner. Partner work is crucial with ELs, especially as you all know. Students can say why the key details are key details. And so we want to look at the message and the discourse provided by the teacher during instruction. We want to build that language of analyzing that text, language of justifying a point, and presenting and justifying key details. When we are providing them with sentence stems and structures, we look at simple and complex sentences that illustrate evidence for statement. Some of those sentence stems are a key detail from the text is, this is a key detail because, key details include, we agree that, and our key details. So those are great sentence stems to provide students to scaffold throughout this lesson. And then looking at the academic vocabulary and just the vocabulary students are going to need to produce the language. So we have word phrases, we have general academic language and vocabulary, and then we have specific technical vocabulary as well. And really planning, when you're planning lessons, just looking at the vocabulary that students need in order to really provide more information about and more sentence stems in regards to what they're learning about. Building language is very important in regards to language development and content. And as the teacher in the classroom, we do that as we provide lots of supports for our students. Next slide, please. And so when we are interacting with text, we want to think about what are some scaffolds that we allow the students to use, what are some tools. And so we think about what is the main idea of the passage, what details from the passage helped you determine the main idea. And so allowing students to interact with the text by color coding, highlighting, really identifying that main idea and whatever text you provide to the students. And then in yellow, it just allows them to really identify the details that support the main idea. This also allows for discourse and words and phrases that students can use when they're generating their own answers in that discussion with the classroom teacher and amongst their peers. It allows them to just provide a tool to analyze the text. Next slide, please. And when we look at scaffolds that students can use while interacting with text, this is just one example. It's just a graphic organizer where students will work with the partner to identify and discuss the main idea. Students will identify key details, and then they'll record their details on a graphic organizer. And that's just one example we wanted to provide. Those scaffolds are really important while the teacher is providing and modeling for students, very important to do with all of the sentence stems that have been provided as well throughout the lesson. Just some things to use, and knowing that the general language would be analysis, justify, and evidence and details. And that's really important verbiage for students to use as well. Next slide, please. And so now we're going to take it to another level, expert jigsaw. So in this expert jigsaw, we divide students into 4 groups of 4. We assign 1 student to be the group leader. We divide the topic and text into 4 sections. We assign each student to learn about specific information from the text. You give students time to read, reread that text, interact with that text with their partner and their group, and they become the experts on that topic they are reading. Students then discuss the information they've read in their small group, and they present information to the whole group. So that's just an overall general expert jigsaw. Next slide, please. And now taking the lesson from identifying the main idea to identifying main idea and supporting details, we're now going to extend the students' learning and just really take it to the next level with this expert jigsaw. So we want to go back to that essential question: what were the benefits and costs, positive, negative effects overall of the Transcontinental Railroad? So again, you would divide your students into groups of 4. You would assign them to read various texts about the Transcontinental Railroad. You would assign some groups to become experts on the benefits and some to become experts on the costs. They will identify, they discuss, and they record the key details that they are reading about and learning about the positives and the negatives in regards to the Transcontinental Railroad. And students are given the opportunity to record the information that they read from the text using note cards labeled positives and negatives to record their answers. And students will discuss the positive and negative effects and explain the impact they had on the Transcontinental Railroad. And this is all done as the teacher is scaffolding and providing that discourse and those supports and those tools for students as they are working together and asking them those higher level questions to guide their inquiry as they are reading in regards to the positive and negative effects of the Transcontinental Railroad. And this is where they could also use that tool, that scaffold, where they are highlighting the main idea in green and then supporting details in yellow. And it just allows them to really interact with that text with their partners and scaffold it all by the teacher. Next slide, please. So now when we extend, as we're thinking about this, this unit and this lesson, we want to take it now to the next level. So we still will do an expert jigsaw, but now we want to think and we want to take the students to a different level of thinking. Who were the laborers behind the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, and what were their experiences and perspectives? So based off that first text, that kind of just gave us a solid base in regards to this topic. And then students were able to read about it and partner up. And now they're going to extend their ideas. They've learned all this information about this topic. So in regards to this activity, again, you would divide students into groups of 4, assign each group of students a group of laborers to read about. Each student will read a biography about laborers in regards to the Chinese, the Irish, the freed slaves, Native Americans who worked on the Transcontinental Railroad and what were their experiences and perspectives. We also have shop owners, and there's just so many different diverse perspectives with this unit. And so students can learn and read about all of them and become real solid experts on the group of laborers that they read about. And students will then record the information they read about from the text using note cards to record their answers. And that piece where they are physically taking down the notes and recording their thoughts and recording those ideas from the text is really, really important, as well as they're developing their language and their discourse with all of the information that they are learning. And then I see a comment in the chat. Yes, so I love that. You must be very strategic in regards to setting up your groups with Jigsaw. Absolutely. You can definitely look at the groupings. I've read a lot about that, and I've seen some great things happening in the classrooms where they can be set up with different academic levels and expertise levels and even culturally based. So it's really interesting to see those kids come alive because they take ownership of their learning and they become those experts in whatever topic that they're learning about. Okay. And now we're going to be looking back. Why did we incorporate all of these activities? What were the purpose? What is the purpose? And that's where this handy tool comes into place with our ELD framework. You know, as we were planning this, it was really important to make sure we hit a lot of these scaffolds and these tools, very important for our students. So we're going to look back to the lesson and thinking about the Rally Robin. What was the purpose of that? Well, it provides students an opportunity to share their knowledge of trains and learn from one another. They definitely get to talk with one another, share, read, interact. It establishes the key academic vocabulary, understanding the meaning of the words, both academic and specific words for the ELA practice and lesson. The activity with the main idea and key details, that is just as important as students are reading multiple texts. It allowed them to scaffold. They were allowed a scaffolded graphic organizer for students, and they were able to discuss, identify, and record their thoughts and ideas learned. Paired activity role play. Students were able to extend the learning for students to apply their understanding of text analysis through paired or independent activity. And then the expert jigsaw. Students were able to apply their understanding of text analysis, in which they will be required to analyze their portion of the text and share its main ideas with their group. Next slide, please. That's okay, thank you. Okay, so when we are planning these lessons, we want to really think about what dialogue is being used. What dialogue are we using with our students as the facilitator in the classroom? So what are things we can do? Well, when we share our experience, we provide sentence stems as such. My experience being on a train happened when. I rode on a train when. Or I've noticed that trains I can relate to and an example of. And then we also want to think about having students, when they share their thoughts and listen to others, here are some great sentence stems for them to use. The primary reason for, and then they give an example and they give the reason why. And then can someone explain? When you said, did you mean? I agree or disagree. And these are great sentence stems for students to use as they are using those key counts. You know, they're going to be arguing, they're going to be explaining, they recount. So these are really important sentence stems for students to use as they are developing that academic language with teacher support. And providing evidence. That's important as we read any body of text. And so when students are explaining their answers, they can use these sentence stems. An example of is when. To support the main idea claim, the author provides evidence that suggests, based on the synthesis of the documents, I believe that. And from the reading, I know that. So it all depends on what level your students are at as well. Some of this language is a little bit more sophisticated, but later on this presentation, we'll talk about the different levels, and this can be done at all different proficiency levels when students are learning the English language and incorporating those the academic vocabulary and discourse. Next slide, please. So thinking, how do these activities support meaningful discourse? And that's definitely what we want to continue doing in our classrooms, is providing that meaningful discourse. And so just the rally robin, main idea, paired role, expert jigsaw. So take a minute and think, how do these activities support meaningful discourse? And then go ahead, once you have your thoughts, go ahead and respond in the chat. You can also unmute if you want to share.
And, you know, as they're responding in the chat, I was just thinking, we were talking before we got started, and I was just wondering how many of you are actually virtual or hybrid? What type of instructional model are you guys currently following? Because we know that it can be tough, right? To offer it in many different ways, but use your platforms like your Google Classroom, right? Jamboards. We found so many different resources right now that are truly helpful.
Yes, and Catherine, thank you. They provide a structured way for students to discuss the content effectively. Absolutely. And some of us full in-person or full distance via Google Meet. They provide structure in a way for students to feel confident when they are speaking. Absolutely. Yep. Whether, you know, if your kids are in the classroom, you know, referring to that anchor chart up on the wall, these are great anchor charts to put up with those sentence stems, or on the virtual platform on your Google Classroom, or when you're sharing your screen, and even providing students that opportunity to write some of these sentences down on a sheet of paper when they're at home. So definitely great structures. Yes, the breakout rooms. Ebony and I love breakout rooms. Okay. Yep, they allow students to learn from each other. Absolutely. And it's so important because there's so many diverse perspectives in the class, and that, you know, is one huge component is just recognizing those and just really tapping into all of those perspectives in your class, culturally, academically, but it does definitely allows the students to participate and definitely feel very confident. Great. And I see Nearpod and Padlet. Those are great resources as well. Yep, to get students involved and engaged, especially on the virtual platform. Awesome. Okay.
They're all great ideas.
Yep.
I think that the most important part to learn about this crazy year is what I keep calling it, is to never be afraid to try new things. And that's the same thing we tell our students every single day. So think the same way for yourself, okay? All right, I think we're ready for the next slide. And so this is what I like to call the meat and potatoes, right? We're gonna dive into the document and we're really gonna dissect it to figure out how to best use it in our classrooms and with our planning. Okay, so the Nevada ELD Standards Framework is broken down into content areas, as you can see right here on this slide. But today we're focusing on the ELA instructional guidance for grades 4 and 5. Next slide. So the next few slides are also going to focus on using it as a resource. So at the conclusion of this training, you will be able to make clear connections between the content standards, the content disciplinary practices, and the ELD standards. So here's the cool thing that I will be excited about if I were a teacher or even a coach, because you can share this with your teachers. Did you know that the Nevada ELD instructional guidance documents have been aligned with the Nevada Educator Performance Framework? I mean, you can get a 2-for-1, right? Not only are you improving the instruction for your students, but you're also improving your practices. So as an educator, you would be doing, you get a 2-for-1 deal, right? Okay, next slide. At the beginning of the framework, there is a table of contents that will help guide your use of this document for the language of language arts. This ELD framework provides educators with like a window into the academic language proficiency that's needed across the subject of language arts. So the components of these standards will support all educators with organizing curriculum, instruction, and assessment around academic language development. So let's move into the next part, which is one of my favorite parts, the student and the teacher moves. All right, so student moves are language descriptors of proficiency level statements that kind of illustrate what the students can do at various proficiency levels. So you will find that there's going to be ranges, and we'll talk about those in the next slide, but they are shown in the language developments of receptive, which is listening and reading. This revolves around how students receive the language. I like to refer to it as input. How are they receiving it? And then there's also productive, which is speaking and writing. So how are students producing the language? And again, I refer to this one as output, right? Teacher moves are research-based supports for ELs and other students to produce, process, interpret, and collaborate within the academic language to make meaning. So the framework provides actionable steps that all teachers can take to provide effective instruction for English learners and other diverse student populations. So now that I've described what they are, we're going to look at how the moves are presented in the framework. Next slide, please. So again, the student moves it focuses on what students can do. So when we look at the particular student moves, we are referring, this one in particular, we're referring to receptive, listening, and reading. So again, this is around input. How are they receiving it? How are students receiving the information? The supports for students should be focusing on providing visual, graphic, or interactive supports while teaching students the concept in order for them to progress towards proficiency. So when you look at this, you would always start in that middle range where it says developing and expanding. And so you want to always start here. This is primarily where a lot of our 4th and 5th graders would fall. And then you would move to the left or to the right according to their levels. And so in this example, we started with a developing and expanding activity in which we provided students with an opportunity to share their prior experiences in order to make predictions about the text. We also provided an opportunity for students to form or infer main ideas and details using grade level materials. So this was done through the jigsaw activity, which would be considered a level 5 or a level 6 activity. A support we could have added, right, that would have been on a level 1 or 2 could have been us providing visuals with word parts in the building background activity. So you could have used a picture of double-sided arrows to represent a cross. You could have used a picture of a continent, preferably North America, because they're familiar with it, to represent the continent. The purpose truly of this document is to identify the level of your students and then use it to add supports. Next slide. So this next student moves focuses on productive speaking and writing skills. Again, this is the output. What should the students be able to show? For planning purposes, you would use these student moves like the previous slide. You would start in the middle in the developing and expanding range and move accordingly based on the levels. I'm sure that we can all agree many of our ELs struggle with these things, but not only just our ELs, but all of our students could really benefit from these supports. So it's important to know that it's helping all of your students and not just your ELs. As you may have noticed in our activities, we try to address all of the domains. Students need experience and exposure to all of the domains, listening, reading, speaking, and writing in order to improve in those proficiency ranges. And so here's how we transition through the levels. As a prerequisite activity, we had students use a graphic support by having students use a main idea and supporting details graphic organizer that Emery shared. That would be considered a level 3 or 4. We also provided an opportunity for students to produce oral reports by discussing the perspective of an individual affected by the Transcontinental Railroad. That would be considered a level 5 and 6. So again, and then you would move to levels 1 and 2 and find those supports if you had students on that level. Next slide. Next up, we have our teacher moves. So again, these focus on action steps for your planning. So the teacher moves focus on building the language itself and their general supports that can be used in any topic area. So typically, first you would plan your lesson with the standards as your foundation, and then you would bring this document into play. You would look at your standards and curriculum, and then go back and see how you can add in these supports throughout your lesson. In our example lesson, we supported our students by encouraging them to use full sentence responses by asking open-ended questions and then also providing them with sentence stems to use. We also built background knowledge when we used jigsaw reading to scaffold independent reading. And we also allowed students to share their prior knowledge of the topic. So again, Emery talked about it and we kind of discussed the use of those anchor charts, right, in the classroom so they can always refer back to them. I know the kids love reading the wall. We always have word walls too. So just know that they use the resources on your wall. They're there for a reason. And it's okay to make them virtual too. So again, using resources like Google Classroom, Padlet, Nearpod, Pear Deck, all of those supports help the students. You know, I think they need to see it visually. A lot of us are visual learners, so thinking about those different modalities as well. And then always ensure that you're providing for a range of supports, moving through the proficiency levels based on your students' needs. Next slide. So this is the second half of the teacher moves, and it focuses on collaborating. I always say that the more students are talking, the more they are learning and retaining. I'm sure many of you have noticed that there are often times when students retain more when they're working with a partner. We can all say that. Or when one of their classmates teach them something. In our example lesson for today, we asked students to record their notes on a note card to assist them with retelling. So that's a great strategy. We provided dialogue structures through the use of the Rally Robin. Prior to that activity, I would have also explicitly taught the students how to engage in that conversation with their partner, which typically they teach when you do Kagan structures and things like that. We also provided an opportunity. Oh, sorry. Yep, still there. We also provided an opportunity for students to participate in small group discussions through the extension jigsaw activity. So just in the chat, what were some ways that you would have altered the lesson that Emery and I presented to you to provide an entering or an emerging support? So when you look at those, under that column, it talks about participating in pairs, engaging in pair work, using numbered heads together, think, pair, share. So if you could just drop in the chat, it's another activity that you could have added in there to provide the collaboration piece. There's interactive journals, think, write, pair, share. And as always, if you feel that you can unmute, we would love that. If you don't want to type it all in. Yes, Erica, would you mind unmuting and just tell me how you could have altered this activity with that think, write, pair, share?
Hi. Yeah, I just think that I was actually thinking of a quick write, just to give students an opportunity to process on their own and then share their thoughts. and then integrating a think, write, pair, share, where maybe they could bring their thoughts together from the quick write. That way they have that opportunity to practice on their own and then rehearse together and come to a consensus, is what I was thinking, where I would probably begin in the beginning when we were preparing the learner, were my thoughts.
Absolutely. I think that's a great idea. And I think they would feel more confident, right? Being able to present to the rest of their classmates if they were able to share with a smaller group first. So I think that's a great idea. Thank you for sharing, Erica.
You're welcome.
All right. I don't see anyone else, so we'll keep moving along, but please always enter in the chat if you have any questions or want to share something with the group. Next slide, please. So as we look back through our lesson, we have aligned our activities and supports with the teacher and student moves from the ELD framework. The student and teacher moves in general were developed so that students can build their critical thinking, analytical, collaborative, and discussion skills. So these moves are designed to cultivate students who are confident, articulate, and expressive. So as you have probably already realized, there are plenty of opportunities for integrated experiences through the standards. So as a fourth grader, not only should you be able to identify the main idea and key details of a text, but students should also be able to engage in a range of collaborative discussions. So this is when you can incorporate those speaking and listening standards, right? And you can also assess them for those. There's also a speaking and listening standard that reports on the text while using appropriate facts and relevant details. So it's important to note that it's well-rounded for you to provide these opportunities for students to engage in this collaboration. Next slide. All right, and this is just a continuation of those activities that we did in the example lesson. If you realize that you didn't provide these opportunities at any time in your lesson, you can always go back, look at your lesson plans and add them in. You can even use the student moves as almost like a checklist and identify whether or not you provided a range. So just know that it's good to go back and as a practice and just look and see how you provided these opportunities for discourse throughout your lesson. Okay, slide 37, please. And if you could click it one more time. All right, so I have these specific questions, but I think right now is just a good opportunity for everyone to kind of share and digest what we've been going through and give some of your personal experiences, right? How would you provide additional supports, or what are some things that you've been doing in your class, or as a coach, what are some things that resources you've been providing for your teachers in order to support their English learners? Ooh, Catherine, I'm going to call you out. Can you unmute for us and tell us a little bit more about those anticipatory guides?
Oh, I just think it's a great way to kind of activate their prior knowledge and get them thinking. And I really like to do the extended anticipatory guides also, where they come back to it at the end and then kind of justify their agree or disagree with evidence from the text. That just builds that, getting them to pull the evidence from the text helps them kind of solidify that skill.
Absolutely.
So I just think it's a great way to get them thinking throughout the whole lesson, and they can talk with the partner. I give them formulaic expressions at the bottom to talk back and forth with their partner on those.
Yes, absolutely. I agree. Again, the more they're talking, the more they're learning.
Yep, absolutely.
Yes, absolutely. Thinking maps. Yes, Emma. And graphic organizers with words and non-linguistic representations. Absolutely, Emma.
I love
muting.
thinking maps. Yes, thinking maps are a great tool for all students, especially EL, but yes, and turning in their thoughts into a writing piece for sure.
All right. Thank you guys for sharing. That was awesome. Oh, last one, Kristen. Lots and lots of visual references, paragraph frames, sentence stems. Absolutely. Sometimes I think that's a block for most students, right? When they don't know where to start, so they don't start, right? They just sit there with a blank paper. So I agree. It is important to provide them with those sentence stems. Okay. Thanks again, everyone. Next slide, please. So there are a total of 6 disciplinary practices, which we briefly identified on the table of contents. These disciplinary practices are specific to the English language arts, while the previous student and teacher moves were more general and can be used in the subject of English language arts in totality. So again, as Emery mentioned on slide 18 with that chart, we decided to focus on supporting analysis. And so within language arts, there are 6 disciplinary practices, which are supporting analysis, producing clear and coherent writing. So you can see 3 on here, but there are a total of 6. Constructing valid arguments, building and presenting knowledge, building upon the ideas of others, and using English structures to communicate. So there are a total of 6, but again, we focused on supporting analyses. We could have chosen various directions in regards to the disciplinary practices, but again, we decided to focus on supporting analyses. So if you like, you can start with the disciplinary practice and identify how you want your students to respond to the lesson. And then you make sure you align the disciplinary practice with the assessment for your lesson. What do you want the students to be able to do, and what should that end result look like? This will drive the language that you should be using throughout your lesson. So today we gave you a broad example, a lesson that is more like a unit, right? Because we did multiple activities within there, but we know that wouldn't happen in one lesson. However, we wanted to give you examples of a variety. Next slide, please. So this teacher moves focuses again on supporting analyses, and it focuses on what supports a teacher can provide the students with to use the language to interpret or make meaning of the content. So these are teacher moves that need to be explicitly used or integrated during direct instruction. So a lot of this looks like a teacher modeling their thinking out loud for the students and teaching them how to do so as well when they're working with a group or independently. And again, this is very similar to the other student moves, right? You would move to the right if you needed to increase the rigor, and move to the left if they needed some more supports. Next slide. And so finally, the ELD instructional guidance document also includes the success criteria. And these are examples of how students will be able to demonstrate their learning of language and content at different language proficiency levels. So it's important to note the difference between each of the level ranges. Students in the entering or emerging range will be successful with the use of visual supports, word banks, and sentence frames, while students who are considered to be in the developing or expanding range can orally explain the text using visual supports and word banks, but without the use of sentence frames. And so if you're anything like me, I looked at both of those levels, right? The developing and expanding, and then the bridging and reaching, and you might notice that they look the same. So just know that the difference would be the elaboration that a student is able to provide, and then also the complex sentences that they would be able to provide. So this would again be the output, right? This will be what the students are able to produce. And so that is pretty much the ELD framework for English language arts. In a nutshell, right now, I think it would be important for us to ask some questions and really just collaborate with one another regarding what you're doing, and then also, share out some ideas with one another.
So I have a question about the dialogue guide. So is it like recommended or best practice to kind of make that dialogue guide for the different sections, rather than, like, I use formulaic expressions, but I put them up like at certain points in the lesson for whatever it is that we're doing. But really each lesson should have its own dialogue guide that breaks down like the kind of standard or skill that they're doing within the frames to use.
Especially with the language, right? So depending on what disciplinary practice you're working on, it would depend on what type of language support you would provide them with, right? So I think that you can always have a general repertoire, right? That's up in the classroom that they can always use, but giving them those specific ones when you, when it's warranted, shall I say that, right? That was a really good question though.
Yeah, when it aligns to the lesson, and just thinking about guiding principle 3 with that dialogue guide for sure, and just providing those opportunities for ELs to engage in different in discourse and using different modalities. But I think that goes along with that purposeful planning too. So you can have your general statements, and then you can definitely, like Ebony said, you plan based off what topics and the content that students will be using to discuss that academic language and vocabulary that they're being introduced to.
Again, if you're in person, those anchor charts are really good for that, right? But if you're online, you can use multiple resources and just be sure to tell your students where they can find those. And sometimes you can have the students create them as well. That's when you know that they're really moving into that level 5 and 6 range, when they're able to produce those student stems for one another. Great question.
And, when we're talking about the different levels as well, looking at this student WIDA can-do descriptors too, that helps as well, because that will give you an idea of what your students, what proficiency levels they're at, and it will allow you to move through those different levels of proficiency that we just seen in the ELD framework in the previous slide. Yeah, as we were using this document, it really just, everything just came together. It wasn't something extra. It was just great practice for all students in the classroom. And, and it was just thoughtful planning. We continue to refer back to the framework, which was great. And, like Ebony said, just we used it kind of like a checklist, but it developed a lot of great conversation amongst both of us and our team, just really talking about the lesson and just really purposefully planning, these activities for the learners in the classroom. And so, there's always strength in numbers. So if you plan with your team, there could be a lot of great conversation that comes out of planning unit lessons and just lessons in general.
All right, we'll hand it back over to Sophia and Cool. Thanks everyone for allowing us to present today. We really appreciate being here with you today, and thank you for sharing your greatness with us as well.
Thank you.
So next slide, please. So really, we just want to thank you for being here. And we want to thank our presenters, Ebony and Emery. The ELD Standards Framework is a resource. It is really around language development, the academic language that's needed. It is the simultaneous development of language within content. And this guide is useful in terms of really shaping and sculpturing the language that will be needed for students to be successful. So all of our guides are on the website. All you have to do is to go to NDE, click on the English Language Learner department, and then you can go then to see the webinars that we have. You can see the ELD Standards Framework and those supporting materials there. So we just want to thank you for coming. Here's our information. You can certainly reach us at NDE. We are the lead for this particular initiative that we're collaborating across our state. So thank you again to Emily and to Ebony for really working collaborative with us to bring this information to educators across our state. We do have a quick poll, and let's see where we are. So we really would like to get your feedback, and just remind you to certainly join us for a continuation of webinars to come. We have a webinar on secondary ELA, the ELD Standards Framework and its connection for secondary language arts teachers. And that will be on April 13th. And then we have 2 more webinars that are around social studies and also science. And so we have really a number of well-prepared and knowledgeable presenters coming your way. So if you would take this poll, that would be very helpful. I'll turn this back over to Pam.
Thank you, Sophia, and thank you so much, Ebony and Emery. Super rich presentation, and thank you to all the participants who shared your thoughts and ideas. This is truly a collective effort. We're obviously going to be so much better if we can, like, as you said, I think Ebony, you said this earlier, or it might have been you, Emery, put our heads together, plan together. It's so much richer and funner is a word, to do it together. So thank you everyone for coming. And I believe the survey is in the chat. We really do value your feedback. We look at it carefully to engage in a continuous cycle of improvement on these webinars and to know what you are valuing in them. So please do that. And with that, I'm going to ask Julie and or Delphine if there are any final things that are needed.
No, I think just a round of applause using the reaction buttons for their presenters and for our participants. And thank you participants for doing that survey. So let's just give you all a big round of applause, and we'll see you next time on April the 13th.
All right.
Thank you. I think that's it. We'll keep, once you open the survey, you'll be able to continue doing it, even though we can close the room.